Evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's broadcast number 548, and it's June the 6th, 1982. Yet, what happened? And this is a small community, and you have to be very careful about what you say until you're really sure of what happened. I am with my research, and there's no reason not to be about the station. After being on there 11 and a half years, there were three factors involved. I suggested last week there was what was going on at the station at the time, which was very positive about the program and the format of World Watchers, and then a visit by a suspicious person who had been high up in the intelligence for 40 years who came to my home the Friday before that weekend when it was canceled, the program. And then the way it happened, I am very vague about this because for a while I have to remain that way. I did go over the station this week, and I'm convinced that no amount of letters or telephone calls, and there were literally hundreds, is going to change. It had to be off the air, and that's it. And from what follows, we'll see later on. I'll know more about it in a while, even if it takes several years to find out. The answers do come in, particularly when it happens the way it did. It's interesting, the San Jose Mercury called me, one of the editors or managers of that paper. Carmel is a busy little community. It's a small town. San Jose is a larger metropolitan area, actually larger than San Francisco now, about 100 miles from here. And they called me by Wednesday and said, "We understand you're not on KLRB anymore." And I said, "That's right." And they wanted to know what stations in the area, Bay Area, the program was still on. And they were going to put an article in the San Jose Mercury Monday about the other programs, the World Watchers that are on in that area. I didn't think it was that newsworthy for them to pick it up that fast. And it was interesting to me because he referred to the article that Jill Wolfson did in the San Jose Mercury, the cover story in the magazine section, about 2 months ago. And I was even apprehensive when she came here because these things tell more people about your program, but they also bring a reaction. They turn people on and you want new listeners, but then there's some counteraction that happens afterwards. And one of the things that she held up the distribution of the article or the printing it was she wanted to know how many World Watchers I have, how many people listen to the program, how many tapes go out, and who they go out to. And I said, well, that is really none of your business. I'm only on the air to share my research with those who want it, and I'm not at liberty to tell you, and I wouldn't tell you if I knew, but there's no way of knowing. So just before it went to print, the editor of the San Jose Mercury called me, and they wouldn't go to print unless I told them how many. And I said, I don't want the article. Forget it. It turned out not even to be a good article, but it did mention KLRB and some stations up in the Bay Area. And I said, just scratch it off. I couldn't care less, and don't bother with it. But they went ahead and printed it anyway. In this Sunday's San Francisco Examiner and Chronicle, there's an article about the radicals in the 60s and the free speech movement at Berkeley. Mario Savio he's now 39. He led the protests and the anti-war activity in the free speech movement and the campus. And the FBI has now revealed documents that papers in Berkeley got on the free speech movement. And in those documents, there were memos of J. Edgar Hoover going back to 1960. This is before the Kennedy assassination and before the war in Vietnam had really escalated as of 1964. And in a confidential memo, May 13th, 1960, J. Edgar Hoover told the San Francisco office that there's an organization of less than 1% of the student body composed not of the Communist Party, but of free-thinking people and students in the area, and that they should cover their activities at school, and they followed DeSavio when he traveled around the country. This is before the anti-war movement. And DeSavio said when he arrived in New York airport, this was in the early years, there was a press conference for him, and there were special agents of the FBI under the guise of newspaper reporters, and they set up a press conference, and they asked him how many communists were in the free speech movement, and he wasn't even aware or working with communists, but they tried to link him to communists, but they disguised themselves as reporters to get information about his activity and his organization, even though they knew that they were, in quotes, free-thinking people, even socialists or Marxists or students. They couldn't label them, but less than 1% of the student body listened, and therefore they had to begin their FBI memos on Savio. So people disguised as friends are sometimes newspaper reporters, and the reaction you get to becoming more listened to, people catching on to what I've been saying for years. I was getting a wider audience of all ages, and I'm getting letters and calls from people who understand now what I've been trying to say for the past years. So as you get a larger audience, you expect some kind of reaction, and I'm not sure that's what caused it, but I have a pretty good idea, and as time goes on, I'll share more that I find out with you. This week on television, there was the great one-hour movie on J. Edgar Hoover, and the American Broadcasting Company had to put that on to show, again, Lee Harvey Oswald saying he was a Marxist and standing in front of the International Trade Mart. And they left out a good part of J. Edgar Hoover's real activities, and I remember going back to the sheets of past tapes that I have. Many of you may have the inventory of tapes. In 1977, August 1977, I did a program number 284, we're on 548 now, J. Edgar Hoover's Nazi connections, the Nazis in South America and in America, and the Nazis from Germany with J. Edgar Hoover. And in 1977, in October, I did a program, part of the program was on ABC Broadcasting, Selling Lee Harvey Oswald's Guilt. So it's 5 years later, and American Broadcasting is still trying to sell the idea that Lee Harvey Oswald was a communist, and not explaining why J. Edgar Hoover would cover that up just when he's looking for communists under every rock. But the role of J. Edgar Hoover in Interpol and with the Nazi organizations is the best kept secret, except among certain researchers, and this program was the first one to even suggest that he used too much power in the agency. There was an article in Gung Ho that I referred to several weeks ago on program 545 about why William Seymour called the CIA's Man for All Nations. And in the July issue of Gung Ho, which is an interesting magazine, put out in Derby, Kentucky, Charlton Building, if you want to order it, Derby, Kentucky 06418, you can write and send for copies. A new subscription is $14 for 6 issues. They advertise, get there quick with Gung Ho. This is July issue. Do you crave fast action? And it tells how to fight in Afghanistan, Africa, Central America, and so forth. Read what the professional reads and learn tricks that keep you alive to fight another day. From mercenary operations to Africa to presidential guards in America. And I'm sure they're referring to guards such as those that, in quotes, protected John Kennedy, or even Ronald Reagan with the double shooting, the possible double or triple assassins right there at the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. in March last year when Ronald Reagan was shot. This magazine, the articles that I have for May, June, and July seem to be very honest, direct articles with some good information in them, and I'll be doing some more with you about these articles. But they're advertising how to operate as presidential guards in America. Now, J. Edgar Hoover, the part they didn't show in the movie, was active in the organization Interpol, and I'll do a detailed broadcast on that again for you. I haven't done one in the last 3 or 4 years. Hoover was affiliated with Interpol as early as 1935. He had direct contacts with them, and this was the international police that Hitler founded in the 20s after they began rearming Germany. He had direct communication with the high officials, Mr. Oscar Dressler and Mr. Heydrich, the Reinhard Heydrich, the chief of the Nazi police, and he was the one who began the Jewish solution of killing all the Jews that they had on the continent of Europe and elsewhere if they conquered that. Heydrich was president of Interpol from 1940 to 42. Hoover had to lose his connections in 1941 after Pearl Harbor was bombed because he had pictures of Nazis in his office. And after Heydrich was assassinated in 1942 in Germany, Ernest Kaltenbrunner took over the Interpol presidency, and then he was hung for war crimes at Nuremberg in 1946. But in 1946, J. Edgar Hoover became the vice president, taking over the old files of Jews to be exterminated. And these files are on microfilm and are, I understand, are still kept very much intact and are used by hit squads. And Mr. Bauman was chief of the Secret Service in the United States. He was elected as vice president to Interpol. So when Gung-Ho advertises how to operate with presidential guards in America, and when the chief of our Secret Service in the United States is vice president of an organization that worked with the Gestapo before and after the war, and J. Edgar Hoover became vice president of Interpol after the war in close affiliations with the Nazis continuously, you can understand how easy it is to off a president and have all the information of where he'll be and cover it up. And J. Edgar Hoover, of course, was the man described, at least in this program, as saying the lone assassin, that Oswald was the loner. And they tried to explain on ABC that maybe he was covering up for the mafia, the organized crime syndicate that didn't like the Kennedy brothers, or he was covering up for Fidel Castro and the Russians. Well, I hardly believe that's the case. But by making Oswald the loner, they could divert all the Nazi connections that I've dealt with many times on this program and will always in the future. So the program shows J. Edgar Hoover with some of his flaws in 1 hour, but of course leaves out the Secret Service and Interpol, as far as the Kennedy assassination, the role, or J. Edgar Hoover's role in covering up who killed John Kennedy, and it leaves out the Nazi connections. That is the real secret to J. Edgar Hoover. And part of the movie also showed, this movie this week, showed that J. Edgar Hoover was feeding the anti-communist literature and fires to Senator Joe McCarthy, and Senator Joe McCarthy was also getting this from Georgetown University and members of the Vatican secret military, sovereign military order of Malta. And I want to do more on that this evening, part 2 of the sovereign military order of Malta. I mentioned it last week, part 1, the men behind the Counter-Reformation. This is an article by Kevin Coogan, Coogan, published by Jonathan Marshall in his newsletter of February 1982. And he talks about members of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, which is a second branch of the Vatican. There is the religious, theological branch, and there's the military branch. And many people are not familiar with the military branch. And it's an important thing because it seems that the head of Hitler's intelligence agencies and our CIA and the men directing foreign policy today are all part of this organization. And it's important because in this country, theoretically, we should have a separation of church and state. But are we using the network of the Vatican locations of various people from the Vatican who had a network of their Catholic organization set up, and an overlay of the Odessa, the Otto Skorzeny, Martin Bormann network that would take over and keep the Fourth Reich living? Did they slip the Odessa into the Vatican gown and use our high intelligence people from the OSS and the CIA and Hitler's intelligence combined under the cloak of the Vatican for control of the world and the Fourth Reich? Just quickly to run down the names that I mentioned last week as members of the secret military, sovereign military. I put the secret for the sovereign because they're both. It should be the SMOM, the secret sovereign military. James Angleton of the CIA, Robert Ablanalp, Richard Nixon's friend in the Bahamas, Joseph Bettinger, who founded the Bilderberg Society, William Buckley, James Buckley, William Casey, our CIA director, Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's head of Eastern Intelligence, the chief who formed our CIA, Wild Bill Donovan of the OSS, then became the CIA, Peter Flanagan, head of Nixon's team, who then went on to work for J. Peter Grace Intelligence Operation, and Baron Hilton, Lee Iacocca from Ford Motor Company, Joseph Kennedy, the father of John and Robert and Ted, who they were not members of the organization, James Ling, John McCone, now head of working with the Bechtel, head of the Bechtel Corporation, along with Caspar Weinberger, our Secretary of Defense, Spyro Skouras from 20th Century Fox, Michael Sindona, John Volpe, who was ambassador to Italy, Vernon Walters, the roving ambassador to every country for the Defense Department, and also a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, and William Clark, a very important man. There was an article about William Clark in the paper just this past week, a question, or 2 weeks ago in the newspaper, about William Clark's role in Washington, D.C., and it described him as one of the most important men in Washington, D.C. at the present time, and that he also was responsible for bringing over Helene von Damm. This article is in the San Jose Mercury and also nationally in a magazine called Parade that comes out on Sundays. And William Clark is described very clearly as a devout Catholic who was in counterintelligence in Europe. He was appointed to the California Supreme Court without a law degree by Ronald Reagan. He now is director of the National Security Council. He brought over Helene von Damm, who incidentally also was brought over by Otto von Bolschwing, the man who helped the Iron Guard escape from Europe, those men that you saw on 60 Minutes a few weeks ago, and I've mentioned that Nazi criminal who's been in the Silicon Valley with the Defense Department and Hewlett-Packard and working with Wilson and Turple and the Defense, the CIA, the NASA group. He just died a few months ago, von Bolschwing, but he was instrumental in bringing over Helene von Damm, and also William Clark was supposed to. So the two, in counterintelligence, placed a woman in the office of Ronald Reagan to make appointments as governor. She worked for him in California 8 years, and she now has that office right next to him in the White House, the office closest to him, to help make selections for appointments. So William Clark is a member of this organization. I referred last week to a book, Real Lace, by Stephen Birmingham, published in 1973, Harper and Row, New York. And in this book, he describes the Knights of Malta. Stephen Birmingham wrote Our Crowd and a book on Dakota apartments in New York, and he writes about the wealthy upper class in various capacities. And he has one on the Irish, important Irish people in the United States, and it's titled Real Lace. And in this book, he describes the Papal Order of the Knights of Malta as being the highest Catholic honor of all. And he tells how the Knights of Malta comprise what is the most exclusive club on earth. They are more than Catholic aristocracy. They are the nobility and the royalty. There are over 600 million Roman Catholics, but only 8,000 Knights of Malta. And he goes into the importance of them, that they began and were founded in the 11th century, originally as nursing monks. The Knights captured the island of Rhodes, Rhodes, by the Byzantine Empire in 1309 and called it sovereign, and they were moved out and then went to Malta. They were replaced and set up their hierarchy in Malta. They said the Knights' headquarters right now are on the Via Condotti in Rome. The Knights' scarlet and white banner flies over the huge palazzo. The Italian police say they have extraterritorial rights. They're a special group just like the Vatican. They have their own territory in Rome. Many of you, and myself included, didn't realize that this was going on simultaneously. And it's a nation of its own, like Vatican City. Now, these leaders, some of these leaders, and there's many more that I mentioned, that just were in this one article alone, have two loyalties. One to this other society with its extraterritorial rights, and a part of the Vatican, but separate from the Vatican, because this is obviously the one who makes the military decisions of which countries are overthrown. If they influence the Bilderberg Society and the counterintelligence and all the men I mentioned had a role, say, in overthrowing Iran and putting the Shah in and taking Mossadegh out, or Central America, the coups, and Vernon Walters in Brazil, and the United States in Dallas, and Allende murdered in Chile, they have played a role in what I once ran down was 77 military dictatorships that were overthrown, and the countries were overthrown and military dictatorships were put into power, and that would be consistent with the role of the authority of the Vatican and of these people working for not a democracy, because a democracy makes you weak. And I have some more quotations. I had some on the air last week, and I'll give you some more of the thinking of the Knights of Malta. Now, this book by Stephen Birmingham talks about their extraterritorial rights, and there are 35 foreign nations that have full diplomatic relations with the order. Over the centuries, Catholic kings and queens have been knights and dames of Malta. There is a mixture of Eastern and ancient European nobility, newly rich North and South Americans. Among the most prominent members are King Baudouin of Belgium, Henri d'Orléans, pretender to the throne of France, and Irishman J. Peter Grace, the Honorable D.J. Moore, I mentioned him last week, the ambassador to Ireland, and Danny Thomas, who built a $2 million hospital, St. Jude, in Memphis, Tennessee. This book says for years the Knights of Malta maintained a semi-secrecy about their membership and activities. They're rarely photographed. They put on their hats. They're festooned with ostrich plumes, golden spurs, uniforms with gold epaulets, sashes, ribbons, medals, and decorations. They're well known for their fundraising activities. They have kept their sights focused firmly on the order's ancient military past. You better believe that. With Angleton and Galen and Casey and Allen, the National Security Council, and the list of who's who. This is, and James Buckley and William Buckley, this is, and Vernon Walters and J. Peter Grace, the military branch. Birmingham very gently says that their activities are based on their ancient military past, that they took the island, they drove the knights from the island of Rhodes in 1522, the Turkish fleet, and then the knights took over the island of Malta and fended the Islam off and made a Christian Europe. And he goes on to describe that the Reformation and the rise of European nationalism stripped the order of some of its temporal power, and the papacy was to take its bold defenders back under its wing. So these are the defenders of the Vatican, and the Knights of Malta have been incorporated into the military decision-making branch of the United States Army. Now, every soldier and every officer is not a Catholic. Every person who enlists in the Army is not a Catholic, but the decision-making of who goes to war or where the wars will be, whether it'll be Cuba or Salvador or Nicaragua or Chile or wherever, the decision-making is in the hands of these top people that I mentioned before. And the book by Birmingham has some more pages that I'll refer to on J. Peter Grace because he's an interesting character. Now, this article by Coogan is fascinating. He has some footnotes here about Father Walsh, the anti-communist from Georgetown University that I mentioned him last week, and his links to a Major General Karl Hofshofer, the world's best-known geopolitician in Germany. And he mentions Avery Dulles. That's where I left off last week in this article, talking about Avery Dulles. And the article says that it's very seldom mentioned, the right-wing group of this Malta, the Georgetown group. Avery Dulles' name is never in print, with one exception, a book tracing Martin Bormann mentioned him by Bezymensky, Bezymensky, I. Bezymensky, tracing Martin Bormann. And in that book, it mentions that John Foster Dulles, he was Secretary of the State during the Eisenhower administration, and his brother, Alan Dulles, became the first director of the CIA after recruiting and making deals in Switzerland from 1943 to 45 with Nazis who would be pouring into the United States when the war was over and even while the war was going on. And he says in this article, no one has touched Avery Dulles in print except this one book. But in this book, it tells how Martin Bormann met with Bishop Udell, Hudal, in Rome, in the Via della Pace. Udell was the guardian of not only of Martin Bormann, brother Martin Bormann of the church, but another monk, Brother Avery, John Foster Dulles' son. Udell told Martin he could join Otto Skorzeny, who set up the Odessa, the Thousand-Year Reich. He could go to Spain, or he could go with Adolf Eichmann in Argentine, and he chose to go, Bormann, to Argentine to be with Eichmann. So where I left off last week were the strong henchman with Bormann, who, through the Catholic Church, who went down, sent Bormann down to Argentine. But it doesn't end because Dulles is, this particular Avery Dulles, is based at Georgetown University now, the one who went along and escorted Bormann out. And he recently was the Vatican man at the World Council of Churches. They met in Peru. Now, one of the law offices, a member of the law office of Bolan, Sachs, Bacon, and Bolan, B-O-L-A-N, Tom Bolan, is a member of the Knights of Malta, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. Tom Bolan is one of the leading figures of the Knights of Malta, according to Coogan. And this law firm is the law firm of Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn and David Shine were the two men that worked along with Senator Joe McCarthy in looking for communists in the State Department. Those were the two upfront Jews of the whole organization that were used, just as Bernard Weissman was used for William Buckley and the Young Americans for Freedom as a cover for the people really behind the assassination of John Kennedy. They like to use Jews as a cover, and Roy Cohn goes gracefully for that part. Incidentally, not only was Senator Joe McCarthy pushed into prominence by Father Walsh and J. Edgar Hoover with his Cold War at home, tearing Americans against America, but David Shine owns, and did own, still owns, the Ambassador Hotel where Robert Kennedy was murdered, and that murder made it possible for Richard Nixon to win the presidency in 1968. That June 5th, 1968 murder of Senator Robert Kennedy was in the hotel owned by David Shine, who would have the access to every doorway and hall. Remember, the excuse for not being a conspiracy in the murder of Robert Kennedy was nobody knew which entrance he would leave from. It was an obscure pantry. Well, every pantry could have had an assassin in it. The Soldiers of Fortune tells you how these security guards are placed as guards, as mercenaries around presidents and prominent officials. And so David Shine was a partner with Roy Cohn and Senator Joe McCarthy, funded from Father Welsh from Georgetown. And Tom Bolan, the head of the law office that Roy Cohn is associated with, is a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. Bolan also was the top advisor to U.S. Senator Al D'Amato, and Roy Cohn is the connection to the Italian mafia. He's also written up in the Torma document the Permandex story of the team behind the murders of specifically John Kennedy and the attempted murder on Charles de Gaulle in France. Roy Cohn is the leader of the right-wing Jewish organization, and he's part of the whole Buckley crew. Coogan describes him as part of the whole crew, working out of the office and closest to the Buckley gang, the Saxby, Bolan offices, Roy Cohn, right in there with Senator Joe McCarthy and the Sovereign Military Group, feeding them with this anti-American propaganda. Now, the Buckley crew, according to this article, was in close support with the Mossad. That's the Israeli intelligence. And many of you know that I've a long time been suspicious of the Mossad and Begin and the role of Israel with the far right wing, both in Argentina, in Taiwan, and South Africa, and in the United States. And in this article, he says that Roy Cohn not only was a link to the mafia and the right wing, but along with the Buckley crew and company, they worked with one, the Begin government, two, with James Angleton, longtime control over the Israeli desk at the CIA, and now they've merged to a nutty right-wing Jewish team. And the question of the Mossad, the Jewish intelligence, working with the far right wing has never, ever yet been exposed, and that is a story that is long overdue. Coogan says in this article that the Mossad has a person in Los Angeles, a right-wing Mossad man with tight Vatican South African ties. His name is Amnon Barnes, A-M-N-O-N-B-A-R-N-E-S, and he's based in Los Angeles, a millionaire, and seems to be a connecting link of the Vatican to South Africa to Israeli intelligence. On the other side of this tape, on part 2, I'm going to do some more on the sovereign military branch of the Vatican related to our CIA and to German intelligence. This is side 2 of tape 548, and it's June the 6th, 82, and I'm doing part two, a continuation last week on the story, The Men Behind the Counter-Reformation by Kevin Coogan, the links of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the Knights of Malta, to the intelligence operations in the United States, the decision-making policies, and their links to the Vatican, and the use of the American intelligence and the American government for close ties to policies coming out of the Vatican. Now, in this article, he mentions Cardinal Spellman, and who passed away not too long ago, and Cardinal Cooke as being the spiritual center for the Knights of Malta, that in New York City, where the wealthiest St. Patrick's Cathedral is on Fifth Avenue, is the spiritual center for the Knights of Malta, and Cardinal Spellman was gung-ho during the Vietnam War. In fact, he is blamed in this article for having insisted that Damm, a Catholic, be president of Vietnam. The Buddhists were burning themselves, if you remember those scenes, and there was really a holy war there where they were trying to push the Catholics into taking control of Vietnam. And he refers to Cyril Tumanov, Toumanoff, a white Russian who worked in Rome, who was in the official historical division there and a member of the official historical division of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. And he says this Cyril Tumanov told the author that John Kennedy felt uncomfortable with the Catholic connections and was somewhat ashamed of them, even though his father was a member of this group, and that he tried to show his independence from the Catholic roots. And the quotation here was, "This attitude was a mistake," that Joseph Kennedy was a leading member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, and that this was a mistake. Well, they would know, because the whole team that I've listed here were part of the assassination group or the cover-up of the murder of John Kennedy. They had very important roles in the murder of John Kennedy or related to people around him. And I listed their names and some of them and the relationship to them. Now, Cardinal Cooke in New York City took over this head of the Knights of Malta in New York City, and his major law firm for the Archdiocese of New York City, interestingly enough, is Roy Cohn's office. They used that office of Roy Cohn, Cardinal Cooke, and the man, Roy Cohn, who was behind Senator Joe McCarthy and the scares in this country. Besides Cardinal Spellman's encouraging the war in Vietnam before Cooke, he was, as I say, the spiritual center for this group, and Cardinal Cooke recently was out against the limit of nuclear arms. The head of the Catholic Church in New York City came out when the protests were taking place. This was just recently, about the nuclear arms. He came out against the limitation of nuclear arms. His role is to protect and spiritually advise Americans, and as the head of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta in Fifth Avenue and St. Patrick's in New York, that is his role. In the book, The Irish Lace, The Real Lace, rather, by Stephen Birmingham, he has some mentions of Cardinal Spellman, who took over this important political position in the United States, and I think they're interesting. There's a chapter called The Duchess Brady, and it has to do with a family, an American couple, Mr. and Mrs. Nicholas Brady, who in 1920 took over a villa in Rome. That was right after the Russian Revolution, when the monarchy were all fleeing out of Russia, and Herbert Hoover was over there arming the Poles and the Tsarists, preparing for World War II, just days after the Russian Revolution. An American couple went to Rome, and the Bradys had prominent people from the church as their guests, the princes of the church. And this book describes three of them: Cardinal Bolzano, Cardinal Gaspari, and Cardinal Pacelli. Cardinal Pacelli became Pope Pius XII and is described in the controversial play The Deputy by Rolf Hochhuth, Hochauth. His role with the concentration camps is described in this particular play. There's one scene where a messenger comes and says there's no synagogues left, and he says, "It's not my place. The Jews were not baptized." And there is a statement where the church is concerned, Herr Hitler remains a realist. It was a very controversial play. Pacelli became the Pope Pius XII, and the Bradys were very close to him. They moved to Rome, as I say, in 1920. They kept their homes in the United States. They were related to the the head of the Bureau of Investigations in the United States Attorney General's office at the time, a Francis P. Garvin. And in 1925, a young priest in his 30s, Francis Spellman, went to Rome. He was just in his middle 30s as part of a papal secretariat of state. It was an honor for the American to be there, similar to Pope Pius, John Paul II, going to Rome under Montini, who was Secretary of the Vatican at the time that they were writing passports for Martin Bormann. He was working for the Secretary of the Vatican. Well, at the end of World War I, Cardinal Spellman, Francis Spellman, he wasn't a cardinal then, he was a young priest. He went to Rome, and he stayed with the Bradys. He worked as a papal secretariat of state, and when the Bradys needed a young priest for their chaplain over there, it was similar to the Brideshead Revisited. They had their own chapel. They asked for Spellman, and he took the job. And then Father Spellman got a lot of money from the Bradys. They gave it to the Vatican, and in return, the Bradys were also knighted into the Knights of Malta. And in the book Real Lace, it says Monsignor Spellman was named Auxiliary Bishop of Boston in 1931. 7 years later, he was the Archbishop of New York, and in the process, he rewarded his friends and sponsors, the Bradys. In 1927, through his offices, Mr. Brady was given the Grand Cross of St. Gregory, and Mrs. Brady and Mrs. James Farrell were named 2 of the 3 dames of Malta in the entire United States. Genevieve Garvin Brady became the Duchess Brady in the United States, holding a title, while the brother is the head of the Bureau of Investigations in the United States for the U.S. Attorney General's office. And then this book, Real Lace, goes on to tell their inheritance of $25 million in directorships in 50 corporations, and the links of the Brady family to helping bail out the Chrysler Corporation when they needed a long time before. And then Real Lace goes into another subject. They get away from Cardinal Spellman, who was so political and controlled so many rich Catholics in New York City. And living next door to these people who were influential with Cardinal Spellman was Joseph P. Grace estate. Joseph Grace was one of the sons of Irish-born William Russell Grace. And they get into the politics, the next-door neighbors, and these were all part of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. There was an Irishman that came to this country by the name of William Grace, and he was very political. He worked with Father Coughlin from Detroit, who was very anti-Roosevelt, a far right-wing fascist man of the church, Father Coughlin. Many of you are too young to remember that era. But William Grace had come over to this country with his brother, Michael Grace, and they set up the W.R. Grace Steamship Company, which I mentioned last week. They sold to Spyro Skouras, another member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, and they owned the Grace National Bank, founded in 1850 from Peru. They started there taking money out of Peru. And then their sons, they had a family, and one son was Joseph P. Grace, and that lived next door to the Bradys and Spellmans. And then J. Peter Grace, of course, is directly related to them. And this family had a history of close association with Father Coughlin and extreme right-wing in the United States, the right-wing policies. Now, in the book, The Nazis Go Underground, that I've mentioned several times or many times on this program, written by Kurt Reese, it describes the plans from 1943 to 1945 to take over the world, actually the Fourth Reich, to keep Hitler's legend alive, and how they would reorganize themselves to get ready for the Fourth Reich or the continuous third, whichever way you want to name it. And in the book, The Nazis Go Underground, on page 119, it mentions a group of people that were very pro-Hitler during the war that stayed together and supported Gerald L.K. Smith and, of course, Father Coughlin. And they considered, if I were a Nazi coming in the underground to the United States, where would we go? And they thought about SS General Kaltenbrunner, that he was the head of Interpol before he was hung, and all of his files, and what would we do for future possibilities in the United States. And one of the things they considered, the organizations in the group they considered, would be with William Grace. And in the book, The Nazis Go Underground, it tells how one of the associations they would have would be the Republican Nationalist Revival Committee, almost undistinguishable from Mr. Grace's group, and its president, P.H. Monahan, active before Pearl Harbor, was the secretary to Grace. So they had a direct link to J. Peter Grace and to William Grace, and the Nazis had planned to use the Grace Corporation to continue what Kaltenbrunner was doing with his files, and J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, was using those files before Pearl Harbor, and in 1946 became vice president of Interpol when Kaltenbrunner was hung. So that J. Peter Grace was a constant barometer of the farthest right wing in this country. I mention this because all of them are high officials in the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, and Grace just got a cabinet position appointment by Ronald Reagan. In the book Real Lace, it tells about the relationship of the Grace family and William Grace to that Catholic priest from Detroit, Charles Coughlin, Father Coughlin, and what he was saying on his radio programs. He had a controversial radio program, and he mentioned 350,000 letters at one time that he would get, and he was referring to Franklin Roosevelt because he wanted to arm against fascism and Nazism in Europe, particularly after the Spanish Civil War. I think some Americans could see what was coming down, and Father Coughlin referred to him as a scab president, as anti-God, as an upstart dictator, and would say on the radio that Roosevelt's chief supporters were communists. I remember when I was at Stanford from 1940 to 43, there would be signs and posters about Franklin Roosevelt that he won by a nose, and there'd be big Jewish noses on cartoons all around the campus. I didn't even have any idea what they meant. My folks didn't discuss it with me, and the professors at Stanford didn't talk about it. But the Grace family was very close to Father Coughlin, and there's two books, The Nazis Go Underground and This Irish Lace, and I'm sure there's many, many more, on the relationship of the very far right-wing Catholic Church fighting Franklin Roosevelt and his policies, and they were very pro-Hitler and pro-Germany all along, wanting the United States to line up with Germany against Britain and, of course, against the Soviet Union, and the Vatican right there with the people who were getting the highest honors before and after the war as a part of the war machine. An example of before the war that isn't in the article by Coogan, but is in the book Real Lace, describes a Thomas Murray who was made a Knight of Gregory and a Knight of Malta. He was from the Consolidated Edison Company, and he got these knighthoods, two of the most prestigious papal orders during World War I. Meanwhile, his invention for welding shells was found to be the only one that could be used in the production of 240 millimeter mortar shell, which earned him, in addition to another fortune in government contracts, a special commendation from the War Department. He became president of the Association of Edison Illuminating Company and Murray Manufacturing Company, and eventually headed 5 different corporations. So Mr. Murray is made a knight by the Vatican, the military sovereign group of the Vatican, for his great contributions, and during World War I, he is inventing these shells and the mortar that have killed so many people, and he's also getting commendations for the War Department. I don't want to sound anti-religious because I can go into Roy Cohn and David Schein and the Jewish Nazis, just as Idi Amin is a black Nazi. The fervor with which certain people will sell out their soul or their beliefs, or even they believe them, has no boundaries, and I don't want to sound anti-Catholic. I've been against Israel's arming and selling weapons all over the world. How can a religion be an arms supplier? But there's no contradiction at all, and I just mentioned this Thomas Murray of the Knights of Malta to show you the commendations both from the church and from the U.S. War Department simultaneously. Even more horrendous was after World War II when Reinhard Gehlen, who wanted genocide by the millions and starvation by the millions and managed to disarrange and kill millions of people in Europe, was immediately made a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. Now, as far as the Grace family goes, this article mentions James Peter Grace as president of the United States section of the Sovereign Military Order, and he's the one, again, who's just been recently appointed to cut down expenses in our federal government, which means putting your finger on the poor and letting the rest go free. He's got 8 members of the Grace Company at the present time. On the board of Grace Company are members of Malta, and only 2 of them are mentioned in this article. The other 5 or 6, we'd have to guess who they are. Those 6 are left blank. But one is John Moore, who was the former ambassador to Ireland, and the other is Felix Larkin, Larkin, who's chairman of J. Peter Grace, and at one time was general counsel for the Defense Department from 1949 to 1951, and in 1951 he got the highest award from the Department of Defense. So he was in the Defense Department general counsel for them during the Korean War, when Alexander Haig got his promotions from West Point and went to Taiwan, when Fritz Kramer was advising these people in the Pentagon, and we can't yet discriminate whether Fritz Kramer was that prisoner at Dachau, number 33. I'm still working on it as much as I can. At the time of the Rosenberg trial, again, that was the beginning of the Cold War at home, the prosecution of the Rosenbergs, and then the McCarthy hearings and the Alger Hiss, and the escalating of the Richard Nixon career by chasing Reds, all of them lined up with the Nazi war criminals, and at the same time, J. Peter Grace, a working partner, through these years with Otto Ambros over in Germany from I.G. Farben, who designed the slave labor at Auschwitz and the chemical, the Zyklon B, that for the extermination. So J. Peter Grace had general counsel for the Defense Department. On his board, he's the chairman of J. Peter Grace, honored by the military of Felix Larkin. And this article also mentions Grace as being a director of Kennecott Copper. The book Real Lace also mentions one of the neighbors of Grace and also part of the Knights of Malta as a director of Anaconda Copper. So it doesn't make it too difficult to imagine why John McCone of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta and Bechtel Corporation and CIA director when John Kennedy was murdered would be instrumental in helping overthrow Allende to keep the slave wages for the copper wire and put Pinochet into a Nazi military dictatorship in Chile. Peter Grace is the director of Kennecott Copper and one of the heads of Radio Free Europe. If any of you saw 60 Minutes a while back, 2 or 3 weeks ago, it mentioned Nazi war criminals that were put on Radio Free Europe that should not have been allowed there. There were many of them from the Iron Guard. They didn't even mention Mr. Trivia from the Iron Guard who was brought there. And again, Otto von Bolschwein, the Nazi war criminal who was allowed to get into this country, was instrumental in allowing the Iron Guard to escape from Romania by his own accounts. They were one of the most cruel group in Europe with the concentration camps, and he helped them escape to Berlin, and they were brought to this country, and some of them then were working for J. Peter Grace on Radio Free Europe. If I'm throwing a lot of names at you, and I am because this article that was done by Kevin Coogan has a lot of names in it, and I'm trying to make sense for you regarding the names that he's used in his article. He simply gives the names, but it's a short article, 4.5 pages, but it doesn't make the connections. But just to explain every once in a while what I'm trying to say, or the thesis of what I've been saying for many years, is that the top Nazis worked with Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, and Dulles' son, with Georgetown University, with political senators, with Nazi criminals, to bring them into the United States to make Cold War, to prosecute people, to be witnesses, to play a role that affected the very fabric of this country. There is a television movie this week, Theodore White. He's been talking about the state of America. He has a book out on the state of America and the decline of optimism or feelings since 1956 and what's going on in this country. And the one point about his 1-hour interview, and I know he has a whole book that will leave out the essence of America, is that after 1956, there never was another election in this country. And if you can't get to the heart of what happened to this country, you can't answer the individual single problems that are taking over and strangling this country today. Because 1956, there was an election, and in 1960, that election was overturned by a bullet. A man who won the election was murdered. And he was murdered at a time when he might have pulled troops out of Southeast Asia, might not have gone along with invading. He didn't go along with invading Cuba, might not have gone along with invading Southeast Asia, just as we had done in Korea, and weakened ourselves even at that time. So 1960 was an election that was canceled out. We had an election. Richard Nixon was the selected president, and he lost. And he worked with these teams of J. Peter Grace and James Angleton and Robert Ablanap and Reinhard Galen and Prince Bernhard and William Buckley and James Buckley and William Casey and Wild Bill Donovan and Peter Flanagan. And all of these people had a role with Richard Nixon and the team, Vernon Walters and all of them, Michael Sindona, and they're all linked to the Nixon and now the Reagan administration. So when their chosen man, who'd done them so many favors, bringing in the Iron Guard and all the top Nazis into this country through Project Paperclip and continuously through the Korean War and on, they could stay and become instrumental in Radio Free Europe and propaganda machines. When he didn't win the war and win the election, it was a war in 1960. When he didn't win it, his opponent could be murdered. And in 1968, when Robert Kennedy came along and wanted the presidency, he could be murdered. Nixon became the president. There was a little interim there where Lyndon was in, and then he stepped out, and Richard Nixon became the president. And in order to assure those votes, they had to shoot Wallace to get the other conservative votes out of the way to make sure they had enough to win that election, and Nixon was in. Jimmy Carter was just a little gap by the powers that be until they could put Ronald Reagan in. And all of these people had an important role. So when Peter Grace was ahead of the Radio Free Europe and worked with Mr. Trivia, who Richard Nixon had giving a prayer at the Senate, heading a Senate prayer meeting, and Nazi war criminals bringing the Iron Guard like they were going out of style. Peter Grace was instrumental, along with Otto von Bolschwing, who began working for Warner Lambert and Elmer Bobst, the godfather of Richard Nixon. When he lost the election to John Kennedy and didn't become governor of California, he was brought to a New York office immediately, and Warner Lambert Pharmaceutical and Elmer Bobst, the same people that were directing the life of war criminal Otto von Bolschwing, the superior of Eichmann. They were also working with Richard Nixon. Now, this article also mentions that the Sovereign Military Order of Malta used Project Paperclip, and I've mentioned that before as a most important book, and that these men went to work for J. Peter Grace. And in Charles Allen's book, Investigating Nazis, and he's done an excellent work and has many documented accounts of Nazis in this country, he said that J. Peter Grace used his firm to place ex-Nazi technocrats who were brought to the U.S. Now, J. Peter Grace was not a rocket or missile expert. He was an extension of I.G. Farben and the Fourth Reich, and all that is putting fascism into power in every country. So he brought in businessmen to continue the Odessa or the Fourth Reich under his organization. Now, this article also mentions the one by Kevin Coogan on the Counter-Reformation, the use of the Vatican and the military order of the Vatican to control events that are taking place in our lives today. J. Peter Grace was closely tied to the Citibank Corporation in New York. Close ties to the Citibank, and one of the Citibank directors is also on J. Peter Grace's organization. And he refers to several people from the Citibank who work with J. Peter Grace. One is Robert Millikan from South Carolina, and that's a very important state. It's also brought up in conjunction with persons in the military order in real lace from South Carolina. And Robert Millikan from South Carolina was the financial angel of Strom Thurmond. Now, Strom Thurmond was a man who was very anxious to have John Lennon deported, who did not want anti-war demonstrations. He's been gung-ho for every military operation. He's a far-right person, and Millikan is a supporter of Strom Thurmond, who helped his career. So that through J. Peter Grace working with Ambrose, you get the Gestapo, the continuation of the Nazi hierarchy, also related, closely concealed through their Vatican connections to Strom Thurmond, whose name is linked to Frank Turple. And as I say, Thurmond was the man who wanted John Lennon extradited, and there were people close to John Lennon. I mentioned last week, not close enough to help him, but close enough to get him some documents that were available on those people that wanted him out of the country through Freedom of Information Act or whatever. And John Lennon knew that Strom Thurmond was one of those people that wanted him out. And Frank Turple and George Corocola and Edwin Wilson have long been part of the assassination teams that do the dirty work for these organizations. So that Robert Milliken from South Carolina was behind, or the financial angel of Thurmond. And also, he's a member of a board of Larry McDonald's Western Goals Foundation. It quotes his own private organization. And I've mentioned many times Robert Byron Watson, who testified before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and they deleted the information, and he gave it to Mark Lane, who deleted it from his book, and Dick Gregory, who deleted it from his book on Martin Luther King, the allegations of Larry McDonald's work with the far right wing of the drug smuggling hit teams, the assassination teams that were behind the murders of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. And this goes into narcotics and coins and antique stores in Larry McDonald's area in DeKalb County, the home base of Mitchell Werbel, the designer of silencers for assassinations and assassination teams, DeKalb County, where Larry McDonald comes from, and also Mark David Chapman, who was turned from a Lenin lover to a Christian freak, born-again Christian, went to Beirut, Lebanon, and then came back to the route of the military base at Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, a Christian school in Tennessee, and Hawaii, his trips around the world, and then ending up in front of the Dakota, where he murders John Lennon, who Strom Thurmond didn't like, but J. Peter Grace has on the board Robert Milliken, who helps and is the financial angel of Strom Thurmond. Every assassination or every important murder has an outline of weaponry, training, locations of the real suspects, where they were, their links to the military, and every article that comes out repeats those locations and those names and places. And this just has to be more than a coincidence that these names reappear with these organizations that have this fascist connection. Kevin Coogan mentions in his article that W.R. Grace, William Grace, had ties to Vatican intelligence almost as old as the firm itself, and he refers to an article by Peter Havner in 1888 called A One-Sided History of William R. Grace. That's the man who later is so busy with Father Coughlin and the extreme right wing in this country. It was called The Pirate of Peru, and he wrote at the time the fascist leanings of Bill Grace and the racket that he was running under the Jesuit organization. And Bryce Brothers becomes Grace Brothers. And this is a good point to leave off and continue next week, maybe part 3 on this subject, because Ivor Bryce was very close to Ian Fleming. He was his closest friend. And Ian Fleming set up for British intelligence a landmark location in Montego Bay in Jamaica that is described in the Torbett document and Intrepid, William Stevens's organization of British intelligence. And down in Montego Bay are people important to the murder of John Kennedy and the Permindex group. This is described as in the Torbett document that you can get. It's available. It's $15, and it has a description of the people behind the murder of John Kennedy, or some of them. But Ian Fleming was very heavy in British intelligence. In fact, there's a biography of Fleming that Bryce wrote called You Only Live Once. Remember, Fleming used the title You Only Live Twice. So that the Grace family and their links to I.G. Farben and to Otto Ambrose over there, and to the Vatican, to the CIA, to people in South Carolina such as Strom Thurmond, the tentacles go everywhere, part of the Bormann Brotherhood or Otto Skorzeni's Odessa. I'm trying to describe maybe parts each week of a complicated network that was arranged starting in January 1943 by Adolf Hitler to take over the world and control and keep the 1,000-year right going. And the question is, are our intelligence agencies in the United States diverted for that goal, and is that what's happening to the United States right now? I believe that is what is happening right now. In the meantime, we'll go back to this part 3 probably next week. Keep well and take care, and this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California.